All right, guys, welcome back to another one of our lectures in the Chapter 2 lecture series, and the topic for this presentation is water. Now, water we've mentioned as an example of a polar molecule, so it's important for us to remember that water is polar. We talked about water and the interaction between water molecules when we were discussing hydrogen bonding, so it was important there. And then we also mentioned water when we were talking about our special types of anabolic and catabolic reactions, the dehydration synthesis and the hydrolysis reaction, respectively. So we have already started a little bit to mention water, so you should start to recognize that this is significant in our discussion. There are some important properties of water that we need to make sure to illustrate. So the first of these is that water is reactive. And this is what we've already seen this. We already had a whole discussion on dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis reactions. Sure, you're familiar with that. Water also has what's described as a high heat capacity. And essentially what this means is that water can absorb a lot of energy before transferring from the liquid state to the gaseous state. And it then takes a lot of energy for it to, well, you know, that's basically it. And so the thing for us that's important is that we can use this for cooling our bodies, right? So when that sweat leaves our body, evaporates, it takes a lot of that energy with it. So it's really effective in cooling the body. There's lots involved with water in terms of regulating the temperature of our bodies, but also of the planet. And so that's all very interesting. Water is an important lubricator. We will see water being used in this way throughout the body. We already talked about, remember, there was that fluid in between the parietal and visceral serosa. That was the membrane lining your body cavities. That fluid, remember, was helping to prevent those organ walls from rubbing up against the body wall and causing damage. We'll see water in our movable joints called synovial fluid, and that will be one of its functions there. We'll see water as part of the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF, that's found surrounding your brain and your spinal cord, and that will be one of its jobs there. So we'll talk about this again as we investigate other organ systems. And the final bit for us to really pick up here is that water is described as a universal solvent. Universal solvent. So this is an important aspect. This is important for us because all of the body chemistry that's happening in our body is happening in water. We need to make sure we understand a few terms here. The term solvent is talking about the dissolver in a solution. The term solute is, I like to call it the stuff that's actually dissolved. And together, then the solvent and the solute make up what's called a solution. So I've given an example here using salt water as the solution. Water would be the solvent, and sodium chloride would be the solute. Another example from home might be Kool-Aid or lemonade powder. So if you're making a Kool-Aid drink, the water is, of course, the solvent, and that Kool-Aid powder would be the solute. So that's another example you might be familiar with. Why is water a universal solvent? It's because it's polar. If it's polar, it's going to dissolve other things that are polar. Anything that's a polar molecule or anything that has a charge, so ions, that's the reason sodium chloride dissolves so well in water, is because water is polar. Okay, so I have a joke. I have like 2 jokes that I know, like for my whole life, right? And here's one of my jokes. Are you ready? Why did the polar bear disappear in water? Because he's polar. Ha 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 ha. Okay, so the point of that joke is to help you remember that in the case of solubility, likes dissolve likes. So if it's polar, if it's got a charge, it's going to dissolve in water. So let's see how that's happening. Remember, your water molecule is polar. It has slight charges. It has a slight positive end and a slight negative end. And remember, opposite charges attract. So if you take a sodium chloride crystal and you add it to water, what will happen is that ionic compound will separate. It'll disassociate. And so all of the positive hydrogen molecules in water, or hydrogen atoms in the water molecule, will be attracted and surround the chloride. You can see that in the picture here. And then the opposite sort of thing is happening with the sodium. All of those negative charged oxygen atoms in the water molecule are going to be attracted to the sodium. So the sodium chloride connection separates because the water molecule wants to surround each of those different ions. That ion being surrounded by the water is called a hydration sphere, and that's what's causing the sodium chloride to actually dissolve in the water. You have another example with a glucose molecule. So putting a glucose, a sugar, into the water doesn't cause the glucose to separate, but you still get a hydration sphere forming surrounding that glucose molecule, dissolving it, keeping it in that fluid. Now, molecules like this, molecules that are polar, molecules that are charged, ionic compounds, are described as hydrophilic, because they love water. Hydro's water, philos is love. So hydrophilic molecules are molecules that can be described as liking water. They're going to easily dissolve. They're polar, they're charged. The opposite of a hydrophilic molecule is something that is hydrophobic, where phobia is fear. So you could translate this word into water fearing. So we will see that non-polar molecules are going to be hydrophobic. We're going to talk extensively about a group of hydrophobic molecules called fats or lipids that are going to be important for cellular chemistry. They are hydrophobic. You already know this, though, because we have a whole expression, oil and water don't mix. Now you know why. Oil is non-polar, water is polar. And so because they have different polarities, they don't mix. So remember, when we're talking about solubility in water or solubility, the rule is likes dissolve likes. If it's polar, if it's ionic, if it has charge, it's going to dissolve in polar water. If it's non-polar, it doesn't. The other term to throw out here is called a coiloid. Now, you need to know this term. It's going to show up again next semester, and being familiar with it will be super handy in the future. A coiloid is a suspension in water. So this is something that's too big to actually dissolve, but it's going to stay kind of suspended in the water. So if your protein molecule is really big, but it has charged parts to it, then we're going to see water molecules surrounding it and keeping it suspended, even though it's too big to have actually dissolved. So coiloid is a suspension in the water, molecules that are too big to actually be dissolved by that hydration sphere.